Why do we read? When I asked myself this question, I couldn't even answer it, even though I have spent hours upon hours upon hours of my free time reading. So I began to sit with this question, and what came to the surface was a little bit terrifying because I found that when I am not intentional about how I am reading and why I am reading, the default is to use the intellect like Satan does in Paradise Lost by John Milton. When you read C.S. Lewis's Preface to Paradise Lost, he says, "What we see in Satan is the horrible coexistence of a subtle and incessant intellectual activity with an incapacity to understand anything." I found that this was often the case when I was reading. So I would go to a book and I would take out my highlighter and I would highlight whatever quotes or passages I thought were particularly meaningful, and I would try to memorize them so that later on I could go and recite it somewhere or use it in some other project. It's not a bad thing in and of itself, but when it becomes the only thing I do when I read is to try to memorize as much as possible, I am missing out on so much of the beauty of reading. I am treating it more like an instruction manual to be memorized rather than a beautiful song. You can see parallels in It Was a Magician's Nephew by C.S. Lewis when Uncle Andrew, not of his own free will, is witnessing the creation of Narnia, and Aslan is singing this beautiful song, and things are coming into being and coming into life, and the children are absolutely in awe of this, but Uncle Andrew is just worried about how he can capitalize on the magic of Narnia, especially when the piece of the lamp falls to the ground and grows into a lamppost. The first thing that Uncle Andrew is thinking about is how he can capitalize upon this and make a bunch of money. I find that is a lot of times the attitude that I come into when I'm reading. Instead of sitting and being in awe of what is going on around me in this new world that I'm surrounded in, I'm like, how can I capitalize on this so that I can recite it later? And so, if I am classifying myself in the group of people that is Uncle Andrew and Satan from Paradise Lost, it's good to look at their stories and see how they got themselves in the mess that they're in, even if they don't realize it's a mess in the case of Uncle Andrew, and try to avoid making the same mistakes. And what you see with Satan is the main thing that keeps him from being able to arrive at any sort of knowledge is that he does not want a figure from the outside to impose anything upon him. Further along in the quote that we were reading before, C.S. Lewis says, "This doom he has brought upon himself, that of not being able to understand anything. In order to avoid seeing one thing, he has almost voluntarily incapacitated himself from seeing at all." And the big thing that he is blinding himself to is the need for surrender to God in order for the cosmos to function properly. The ultimate joy and beauty in his life does not come from himself, but comes from a being far above himself, which would be God, who wishes to share his power and his love and his joy with Satan if he would just give up and surrender in order to obtain it. And this is where Satan will even say, "It is better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven." And going back to C.S. Lewis, I am realizing that I'm using everything C.S. Lewis in this video, and I'm perfectly happy with it. One thing you see in the Great Divorce is in the Gray Town, which is hell, but the people there don't really realize that. They have and this is the same in Pandemonium in Paradise Lost, there is a flourishing intellectual world. You see people, they're writing papers, they're making these beautiful masterpieces, but when they get to heaven and the beings there, whether it be people or angels, come to meet them, they tell them the whole point of the intellect and the whole point of art was to serve a higher purpose and to bring you into further joy with something outside of yourself, and that is the presence of God in His created world. But instead of wanting, just like with Satan, instead of wanting to get outside of themselves, they would rather reign in hell than serve in heaven. And I found myself, when I was reading, partially because I had no real purpose in reading besides the fact that I loved doing it, was that I would just cherry pick for what I thought was of value to myself. But anytime that the text, whether it be from the lives of the characters or sometimes even the life of the author, called on me to make a change in my life, I would close my ears and would rather be content to just memorize it, to appreciate its beauty, but not look for the greater meaning in the beauty and to give up and surrender. Was perfectly okay appreciating the aesthetics of it and picking apart the structure and the patterns and the motifs and the themes and how Tolstoy uses the dichotomy of heat and cold throughout his works to convey this meaning. But the moment that he started prodding me with these characters that were going through these spiritual transformations, I threw up my hands and I said, I don't know if I want a part of it. I would rather sit here and appreciate the beauty than to actually have to do the hard work myself that Tolstoy was putting before me. So when I had this mindset of I would rather reign in hell than serve in heaven, when I was reading, this was the kind of train of thought that came out of that. One, why do I read? I read for knowledge. Knowledge is memorization. Its fruit is recitation, which is to be like God, knowing good and evil. There's a reason why there is, in the Garden of Eden story, there is a tree of knowledge of good and evil. And that to take from it in order to be like God, in order to make more of yourself than there actually is, was what caused the fall of all humanity. And you see, and I think there is a correlation when we're reading just to be able to recite or to memorize everything we read, is that we're trying to take knowledge for ourselves in order to make more of ourselves than there actually is. But the whole point the tree was there in the first place was to teach us how to surrender. Throughout church history, there have been church fathers that have seen the tree of knowledge of good and evil not as something that would be completely banished from humanity forever, but instead was put there so that Adam and Eve could learn to surrender to God first and to gain His wisdom and then take of the tree of knowledge of good and evil when they were ready. And the whole point of it was to surrender first and then gain the knowledge. So then you see, if you're following Paradise Lost, you see this parallel between the fall of Satan and the fall of humanity. And it's all about trying to make more of yourself than there actually is, making all the focus on yourself. And what this causes is this circular loop that basically is an intellectual helllock from the inside. So the question that I want to dive deep into and also hear your thoughts on is, what is the difference between reading for knowledge, just pure facts, and reading for wisdom, which is life transformation? So I think this is going to be a fun journey.